The dust was a living thing. It coated the tongue with the taste of grit and regret, a fine red powder that settled on every surface, a constant reminder of the land's indifference. It rose in shimmering veils with the merciless sun and settled in the cool, bruised purple shadows of dusk. The silence was another entity entirely, a heavy blanket woven from the drone of cicadas and the vast, empty sky. It was a silence that could break a man, leaving him to listen to the frantic pounding of his own heart until it was the only sound left in the world. Silas knew this silence intimately. It was his oldest and most constant companion, the warden of the prison he had built for himself at the edge of nowhere. His hands, calloused and mapped with the scars of a life he was trying to forget, worked the leather of a broken rein with practiced, methodical motions. Each pull of the awl, each tug of the waxed thread, was a small act of defiance against the entropy that sought to reclaim everything he had built. He was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape he inhabited. His face was a testament to hardship, weathered by sun and wind into a mask of stoic resolve. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. They saw the hawk circling on a high thermal, the faint twitch of a rabbit's ear in the sagebrush. The subtle shift in the weight of the air that promised a storm was days away. He had come to this place to bury a version of himself, the version that lived and died by the speed of his draw. He had traded the weight of a colt for the weight of an axe, the smell of gun smoke for the scent of pine and freshly turned earth. He had sought solitude not as a comfort, but as a penance. The homestead was his monastery, its fences his prayer beads, its relentless labor his atonement. He had convinced himself he needed nothing and no one, that self-reliance was the highest form of honor. It was a belief as solid and unyielding as the granite bedrock that lay just beneath the thin, stubborn soil of his land. The weekly stagecoach was a plume of dust on the horizon long before it was a sound. It was an intrusion, a brief and unwelcome puncture in the fabric of his isolation. He only tolerated its existence for the necessities it brought: salt, coffee, cartridges. He stood on the porch of his sparsely furnished cabin, a structure as stark and functional as the man himself, and watched its slow approach. He shaded his eyes, his posture rigid. He was expecting a crate of new tools and a letter from a man in a town 200 miles east, a man who had made an arrangement on his behalf. An arrangement Silas was already beginning to regret. The letter had spoken of a practical woman, a widow accustomed to hard work who was seeking a new start. He needed help to make the homestead truly viable, to turn it from a place of survival into a place that might one day thrive. He had told himself it was a practical decision, a transaction. He would provide a home and protection. She would provide the labor he could not manage alone. It was a partnership, not a marriage, not in any way that mattered. The coach shuddered to a halt, the horses blowing and stamping in the heat. The driver, a man whose face was perpetually covered in a layer of grime, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. He nodded at Silas. "Got your delivery?" he grunted, jerking a thumb toward the passenger door. Silas frowned. His tools were usually strapped to the roof. Then the door creaked open. A woman stepped out, and the world seemed to fall silent for a moment, the cicadas holding their breath. She was not the sturdy, weather-beaten widow he had been led to expect. She was slight, her frame delicate, and she moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed utterly alien to this harsh, clumsy land. Her traveling dress, though simple and dark, was of a fine material, now coated in the ubiquitous red dust. Her face was a pale oval, her features precise, her dark eyes holding a depth and stillness that was both unnerving and captivating. She was of Asian descent, a fact that made her stand out here even more than her fine clothes and dignified bearing. She carried a single, small, well-made carpet bag. Silas stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the woman described in the letter. There had been a mistake, a terrible, profound mistake. She stood beside the coach, a fragile figure in the vast, overwhelming landscape. Her gaze met his, unwavering. There was no fear in her eyes, no plea for help. There was only a quiet, unnerving assessment. The driver unloaded her single bag, dropping it in the dust with a soft thud. "That's it," he said, already climbing back onto his seat. "She came with nothing else." Silas's jaw tightened. He looked from the woman to her meager luggage and back again. The letter had been a lie. This was not a practical partner. This was a liability. A city woman, soft and breakable, sent to a place that specialized in breaking things. His frustration was a cold, hard knot in his gut. This was a complication he could not afford, a disruption to the fragile peace he had fought so hard to build. "There's been an error," he said, his voice a low rasp, unused to forming so many words at once. "You're not what I was expecting." The woman, whose name he did not even know, simply inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgment, not apology. "My name is May," she stated, her voice soft but clear, carrying easily in the still air. "And you are the man who sent for a wife." It was not a question. It was a fact laid bare between them, as stark and uncomfortable as the midday sun. He wanted to tell the driver to take her back, to reverse this colossal error, but the man was already cracking his whip, the coach lurching forward, beginning its slow, lumbering turn back toward the horizon. Silas was left standing in the dust with the woman named May, the silence rushing back in to fill the space between them, heavier and more complicated than ever before. The stagecoach vanished, its dust settling back to the earth, leaving behind a silence that felt different now. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but the charged, awkward silence of two strangers bound by a mistake. Silas felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, directed at the faceless man who had arranged this, at the woman for her very existence here, and most of all at himself for believing such a simple solution could exist for his complicated life. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw only the problem she represented. Her hands were smooth, unmarked by labor. Her shoes were thin, unsuitable for anything but a paved street. She would be useless. Worse, she would be a burden, another mouth to feed, another soul to protect, in a land that offered no protection freely. "The coach does not return for a week," he said, his words clipped. It was the only explanation he would offer. He turned without waiting for a reply and walked back to the cabin, his boots heavy in the dust. He left her standing there with her single bag, a solitary figure against the immense backdrop of the plains and the sky. He expected tears or panic, or at the very least a barrage of questions. He received none of them. After a few long moments, he heard the soft crunch of her footsteps following him. He did not turn. He entered the cabin, leaving the door open in a gesture that was less an invitation and more a statement of fact. This was where she would have to stay. The interior of the cabin was as Spartan as his life. A single room, with a stone fireplace at one end, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves holding a few books, tins of food, and ammunition. It was a space built for function, not comfort. It smelled of wood smoke, gun oil, and solitude. May stepped inside, her eyes taking in the entire room in a single, sweeping glance. She placed her bag neatly by the door. Her composure was unnerving. She showed no disappointment, no fear. She simply observed, her stillness a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. He pointed to a small, curtained-off alcove. "There," he grunted. It was a storage space, barely large enough for a cot he sometimes used for storing supplies. It would have to do. He set about his evening chores, pointedly ignoring her. He expected her to sit, to wait, to be helpless. Instead, she removed her dusty traveling coat, folded it with precise, economical movements, and placed it on her bag. Underneath, she wore a simple, dark dress that was far more practical. She looked at the water bucket by the door, saw it was half empty, picked it up and looked at him, her expression a silent question. Silas gestured curtly toward the well outside. The bucket was heavy, the rope coarse. He watched from the window, a part of him expecting her to fail, to drop it, to prove him right. She did not. She worked the windlass with a steady, rhythmic motion, her slender frame leveraging its weight with an intelligence that surprised him. It was not brute strength, but an understanding of mechanics, of balance. She brought the full bucket inside without spilling a drop, her breathing only slightly quickened. This was her first test, an unconscious one he had set for her, and she had passed it in a way he had not anticipated. It was a small thing, a bucket of water, but it was the first crack in the foundation of his certainty about her. He had planned to cook his usual meal, fried salt pork and beans, a tasteless, functional affair. He returned from feeding the horse to find May had already begun. She had surveyed his meager pantry, the flour, the dried beans, the salted meat, a few wild onions he had gathered, and was now moving about the small cooking area with a quiet, focused energy. Her hands, which he had dismissed as soft and useless, worked with a deftness that was mesmerizing. She kneaded a small portion of dough for flatbreads, her movements fluid and sure. She sliced the pork with a knife he kept poorly sharpened, yet she managed to produce thin, even strips. The air, which usually smelled of his own solitary existence, began to fill with the aroma of frying onion and meat, a scent so foreign and yet so fundamentally comforting that it stopped him in his tracks. He stood by the door, a silent observer, feeling like an intruder in his own home. She had taken the chaotic elements of his subsistence and was creating order, creating something more than mere sustenance. She was creating a meal. They ate in silence at the rough table. The food was simple, yet it was the best he had eaten in years. The flatbread was warm and soft, the rehydrated beans and pork seasoned with an expert's touch. She had transformed his grim rations into something that tasted of care, of intention. He ate slowly, the unfamiliar flavors a stark contrast to the grit and dust he was used to. He watched her across the table. She ate with the same deliberate grace she applied to everything, her posture perfect, her movements minimal. She was not of this world, and yet she was navigating it with a competence that defied his every assumption. A fragile truce settled between them, unspoken and unacknowledged. It was a truce born not of words, but of shared space and quiet action. He found himself watching her throughout the following days. He watched her mend a tear in his shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He watched her clean the cabin, not with frantic energy, but with a methodical calm that transformed the dusty, neglected space into a clean, orderly home. She never complained. She never asked for anything. She simply did what needed to be done, her quiet presence slowly, inexorably altering the landscape of his life. His respect for her grew, a slow, grudging tide. He began to see not a fragile doll, but a woman of profound resilience. Her silence was not emptiness, it was a deep well of observation. Her gentleness was not weakness, it was a form of strength he had never encountered before. He found himself leaving a bucket of fresh water for her in the mornings. He began clearing a small patch of ground near the cabin, telling himself it was to keep the weeds down, but knowing, in a place deep within him he rarely visited, that he was preparing the soil for a garden. They rarely spoke. Words seemed inadequate, clumsy tools for the understanding that was beginning to grow between them. A glance, a shared look over the dinner table, the simple act of her handing him a cup of hot coffee as he came in from the cold. These became their language. He was a man who believed actions spoke louder than words, and her actions spoke of a strength and dignity that humbled him. She had come with nothing, the driver had said. He was beginning to realize that was not true. She had come with a quiet competence that was worth more than a wagon full of possessions. She had come with a stillness that soothed the ragged edges of his own soul. The arrival of Jedediah Barlow was as subtle as a thunderclap. He and his 2 hired men rode onto Silas's land as if they owned it, their horses tearing up the fragile soil. Barlow was a man who had grown soft and thick on the greed of others. His face was fleshy and red, his eyes small and avaricious. He was the kind of man who saw land not for what it could grow, but for what it was worth. The kind of man who believed ownership was a right bestowed by power, not by law or labor. He ran the county, owned the bank, and held the sheriff in his pocket. He wanted Silas's homestead because of the creek that ran through its northern edge, a steady, year-round source of water that was becoming more valuable than gold as the summer wore on and the land grew parched. It was the lifeblood of this place, and Barlow intended to have it. Barlow reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the property with an air of contemptuous appraisal. He ignored Silas at first, his eyes fixing on May, who had stepped out onto the porch, her expression unreadable. A slow, ugly smile spread across Barlow's face. Well, Silas," he drawled, his voice thick with false bonhomie. "I didn't realize you'd taken on such delicate company." His men snickered, their eyes lingering on May with a crude familiarity that made Silas's hands clench into fists at his sides. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. "Barlow," Silas said, his voice flat and cold, "this is private property. State your business and leave." Barlow's smile tightened. "Your property?" he scoffed. "This is a temporary arrangement as I see it. A man like you scratching a living out of this dust bowl. You can't possibly hope to hold on to a prime piece of land like this, especially not with the only reliable water for 20 miles. The threat was laid bare, stripped of all pretense. It was not an offer, it was a declaration of intent. "I'm not selling," Silas stated. The words were simple, absolute. Barlow's face darkened. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Everything is for sale, Silas, and everyone has a price. Some prices are paid in cash. Others," he paused, letting his gaze drift back to May, "are paid in other ways. A man with vulnerabilities should be careful. A fire can start so easily in this dry heat. Accidents happen." The air crackled with tension. It was a public humiliation, a direct challenge to Silas's ability to protect his home, his land, and the woman who now stood under his roof. He felt the old familiar instincts stir within him, the cold calm, the heightened awareness, the almost imperceptible shift in his weight as he prepared for violence. But he held it in check. This was not a dusty street in some forgotten town. This was his home. May remained perfectly still on the porch. She did not flinch, did not retreat. Her gaze was fixed on Barlow, a calm, analytical stare that seemed to strip him bare of his bluster and bravado. Barlow, accustomed to fear and deference, seemed unsettled by her composure. He finally broke the stare, turning his attention back to Silas with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I'll be back with a formal offer," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Think on it. Think about how much you stand to lose." He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit, and they rode off, leaving a trail of dust and a cloud of palpable menace hanging in the air. The silence they left behind was different yet again. It was the silence of a coming storm, the quiet dread of a battle that had been declared but not yet fought. Silas turned to look at May. "You should not have come out," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She met his gaze, her dark eyes clear and steady. "He needed to see," she replied softly, "that you were not alone." Barlow did not wait long. The attack came 2 nights later, not with the subtlety of a fire, but with the blunt force of a siege. Silas was awakened not by a sound, but by the absence of one. The familiar nighttime chorus of crickets and coyotes had fallen silent. It was a dead quiet, the kind that preceded a lightning strike. He rose from his bed, his movements fluid and silent, his hand going instinctively to the Winchester he kept leaning against the wall. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtain. He saw them in the pale moonlight, 3 figures moving stealthily through the sagebrush, taking up positions around the cabin. A 4th man, likely Barlow himself, remained on horseback further back, a stout silhouette against the starry sky. They were cut off. A rifle shot shattered the night, the bullet splintering the wooden doorframe inches from his head. The siege had begun. "Stay down," he yelled to May, who was already awake, her form a pale shadow in the darkness of the alcove. He returned fire, a single, calculated shot aimed not to kill, but to drive them back to cover. He was a tactician, his mind honed by a dozen such encounters. He knew the rhythms of a fight, the calculus of cover and ammunition. But he was one man against 3 guns, and the odds were long. The cabin, his sanctuary, had become a trap. The windows were vulnerabilities, the single door a fatal choke point. For the next hour they exchanged sporadic fire. Silas moved from window to window, making his presence seem like more than one man, conserving his ammunition, making every shot count. He was calm, focused. The years of violence he had tried to bury now resurrected in the service of defense. In a lull between shots, May's voice cut through the tense darkness. "There are 3 of them on foot," she said, her tone steady, analytical. "One to the east, by the large rock, one to the southwest in the dry creek bed. The 3rd moves between the 2, providing covering fire." Silas stared at her in disbelief. In the near-total darkness, while he had been focused on the immediate threats, she'd been observing, analyzing, mapping the battlefield in her mind. "How could you know that?" he whispered, his voice tight with suspicion and awe. "I listen," she replied simply. "The sound of a rifle is different depending on the landscape around it. The shot from the rock has a sharp echo. The one from the creek bed is muffled. The 3rd is variable. Their pattern is predictable. They fire in sequence, east, then west, then the rover. They're trying to draw your fire, to make you reveal your position and waste your cartridges." Her tactical assessment was as stunning as it was accurate. She saw the fight not as a chaotic brawl, but as a problem of logic, a deadly puzzle to be solved. He was a fighter, reacting to threats with instinct and skill. She was a strategist, seeing the whole board. He felt a profound shift in his understanding of her. This quiet, delicate woman possessed a mind as sharp and as dangerous as any weapon he had ever held. "They will try to get closer when the moon sets," she continued, her voice never wavering. "They think we have only one rifle. They will try to rush the cabin from two sides at once." Her logic was cold and inescapable. They would be overwhelmed. "What do you suggest?" he asked, the words feeling strange on his tongue. He had never asked anyone for help in a fight before. He had never needed to. "The one in the creek bed is the most dangerous," she said without hesitation. "His position offers the best cover and the clearest line of sight to the door. We must eliminate him first. But the man by the rock will have a clear shot at anyone who approaches the west window." She paused, and he could almost hear the gears of her mind turning. "You have a pistol," she stated. It was not a question. "And a box of shells on the top shelf." He looked at her, his silhouette framed by the pale moonlight filtering through the window. He nodded slowly. "On the porch," she said, "there is a stack of firewood, and next to it the lantern we did not light tonight." He understood instantly. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but it was brilliant in its simplicity. It was a plan born of a mind that saw possibilities where he saw only dead ends. He moved to the shelf and took down the heavy revolver and the box of ammunition. He checked the action, the familiar weight a grim comfort in his hand. He handed the pistol to her. Her small hands closed around the wooden grip, her fingers finding their place with an unnerving familiarity. She did not handle it like a novice. She held it with the steady confidence of someone who understood its purpose, its weight, its terrible finality. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow. Her skills were not just of the mind. He had no time to question it. He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze and gave a single, decisive nod. The transaction was complete. The grudging respect had forged itself under the heat and pressure of crisis into a bond of absolute trust. They were no longer a man and his mistaken mail-order bride. They were partners. They were a single, synchronized unit, ready to face the violence that waited for them in the darkness. The moon began its slow descent, its silver light fading to a soft, gray luminescence that robbed the landscape of its shadows and its secrets. It was time. "Now," May whispered, her voice a bare thread of sound in the charged silence. Silas took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and cordite. He moved to the front door, his Winchester held ready. On the other side of the room, May crept toward the back window, the heavy pistol looking impossibly large in her hands. Their plan was a gamble, a desperate piece of theater designed to turn their enemies' assumptions against them. It relied on timing, deception, and a level of trust that, until a few hours ago, would have been unthinkable. He gave her a final nod. She returned it, her eyes dark pools of resolve in the dim light. Silas kicked open the door and threw the unlit lantern out into the yard, sending it skittering across the hard-packed earth. At the same instant, he fired the Winchester into the stack of firewood on the porch. The dry wood exploded in a shower of splinters. It was a cacophony of noise designed to draw every eye, every rifle. As he expected, 2 muzzle flashes answered him almost immediately, one from the rock, one from the rover. He ducked back inside as bullets chewed through the door frame. The diversion had worked. For a precious few seconds, both gunmen were focused on the front of the cabin, convinced he had made a panicked, foolish move. But they had forgotten about the third man, the most dangerous man in the creek bed, and they had forgotten about the second person in the cabin. While the shots were still echoing, May acted. She shattered the small back window with the barrel of the pistol and fired. She did not fire wildly. She fired once, a single, deliberate, shockingly loud shot that was utterly different from the sharp crack of the rifles. It was a deep, booming roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. A choked cry answered from the darkness outside, a sound of pained surprise that was abruptly cut off. Then, silence from the creek bed. A terrible, final silence. The rover, realizing his flank was exposed, started to move. Silas was ready for him. He stepped back out onto the porch, using the chaos as his cover, and fired twice. The running figure stumbled and fell, his rifle clattering against the rocks. One man remained, the one by the large rock. He was pinned down, his two companions gone. The fight was over, but he didn't know it yet. Panic seized him. He fired a few more wild shots toward the cabin before scrambling from his cover and making a desperate run for the horses. Silas let him go. He watched the man disappear into the darkness, his footsteps fading into the vast silence of the prairie. Barlow, seeing his men defeated, had already fled. The immediate threat was gone. The night, which moments before had been filled with the thunder of gunfire, was now unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the frantic pounding of Silas's own heart and the ragged sound of his breathing. He turned and went back inside. May was standing by the broken window, the pistol still held loosely in her hand, its barrel pointing safely at the floor. A thin sliver of moonlight caught the trail of blood running down her arm. A shard of glass from the window pane had sliced her forearm. The sight of it, dark and stark against her pale skin, sent a jolt through him, a raw, protective instinct so fierce it took his breath away. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He gently took the pistol from her hand and set it on the table. Then, his touch surprisingly gentle, he took her arm to inspect the wound. It was a clean cut, deep but not disabling. "Sit," he commanded, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. He lit a lamp, the warm yellow light chasing the menacing shadows into the corners of the room. He retrieved a clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey from his meager medical supplies. He cleaned the wound, his large, calloused hands working with a focused precision. She did not flinch, did not make a sound, though the whiskey must have stung like fire. She simply watched him, her dark eyes searching his face in the flickering lamplight. The lies and misconceptions that had defined their first days together had been burned away by the violence of the night. All that was left was a raw, undeniable truth. "You're no homemaker," he said, his voice low. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a question that demanded an answer. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "No," she said softly. "My father was a merchant in a city far from here. He did business with powerful men, including a syndicate that Barlow is connected to. They betrayed him. They murdered him and took everything." Her story came out in quiet, measured tones, devoid of self-pity. She spoke of a life of privilege that had become a life on the run. She had escaped with the one thing that could destroy the syndicate. Her father's ledgers, detailed accounts of their illegal activities, hidden in a false bottom of her single carpet bag. "I needed to disappear," she explained. "I needed a place so remote, so forgotten, that they would never think to look for me. An agency arranged these things. They believed I was a widow seeking a new life. It was the perfect cover. She looked at her bandaged arm. The gun. My father insisted I learn. He said a woman's mind and her aim were the only things no one could take from her. Silas finished tying the bandage. The great unmasking was complete. She was not a liability he had been saddled with. She was a survivor who had chosen him, chosen this place as her sanctuary. He had thought he was protecting her, but in the end, they had saved each other. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a fragile woman or a mysterious outsider, but as May, a woman of impossible strength and quiet courage. The silence that settled between them now was not empty or awkward. It was a space of shared understanding, a foundation upon which something new and solid could be built. The next morning, Silas rode into the town of Redemption. He did not go to the sheriff's office first. He went to the telegraph office. He returned to the sheriff, a weary but decent man named Elias Thorne, and laid the heavy ledger book on his desk. He explained what had happened, his account terse and factual. Thorne listened, his expression growing grimmer with every word. When Silas was done, the sheriff opened the ledger. The neat, precise columns of figures and names told a story of corruption that reached far beyond Barlow. It was the proof Thorne had always lacked, the leverage he needed. By noon, a federal marshal had been wired. By sunset, Jedediah Barlow was in custody. His reign of greed and intimidation brought to an end not by a bullet, but by a woman's meticulous bookkeeping and a quiet man's resolve. The law, slow and ponderous, had finally been set in motion. Weeks turned into a month. The brutal heat of summer softened into the golden warmth of early autumn. The land, relieved of the oppressive threat of Barlow, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The creek ran clear and steady. The grass, which had been brown and brittle, began to show hints of green again with the coming of cooler nights. The homestead was changing, healing. The bullet holes in the cabin walls were patched, the splintered door replaced with a new one made from sturdy pine. The broken window was repaned, the glass glinting in the afternoon sun. The changes were more than just repairs. They were improvements. A new, larger window was cut into the south-facing wall, letting in the morning light. A sturdy rocking chair, which Silas had spent a week carving, now sat on the porch. The cabin was slowly transforming from a shelter into a home. The greatest change was in the small plot of land beside the cabin. Where there had once been only dust and stubborn weeds, there was now a garden. It was May's domain, but they had built it together. He had broken the hard soil, his strength turning the unforgiving earth. She had followed behind him, her hands nurturing the ground, planting seeds for vegetables that would see them through the winter. They worked in a comfortable silence, a rhythm of shared labor that needed no words. He would watch her as she tended the young plants, her movements full of a gentle, focused care. In her, he saw the same resilience as the seeds she planted, the ability to take root and flourish in the harshest of environments. The garden was a testament to their partnership, a living symbol of the future they were cultivating together, a quiet act of defiance against the barrenness that had once defined his land and his life. They fell into a routine that was both domestic and profound. They shared meals at the table, the silence between them no longer a void, but a comfortable space filled with unspoken understanding. He would read in the evenings by the firelight while she mended their clothes, the soft scratch of her needle a soothing counterpoint to the rustle of his pages. He learned the nuances of her expressions, The slight narrowing of her eyes when she was deep in thought, the small, almost imperceptible smile that touched her lips when he brought her a wildflower he'd found by the creek. She, in turn, learned to read the landscape of his quiet moods, the set of his jaw that meant he was troubled, the distant look in his eyes that meant he was visiting the ghosts of his past. She never pushed, never prodded. She simply offered her steady, calming presence, a silent anchor in the turbulent waters of his memory. He found the ghosts began to visit less often. The solitude he had once craved as a penance now felt like an empty ache when she was not near. One cool evening, they sat on the porch in the two chairs, one he had always used and the new one he had built. They watched the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of rain. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was a shared blanket, warm and comforting. He had spent years believing that to be strong, a man had to be alone. That connection was a weakness, a vulnerability to be avoided at all costs. He had been wrong. True strength, he was learning, was not in standing alone, but in standing together. It was in the quiet trust of knowing someone had your back, in the shared labor of building a life, in the simple, profound comfort of sitting next to someone as the day came to a close. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the twilight calm. He looked not at her, but out at the vast expanse of land that stretched before them. His land, their land. "The soil is good here," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was a simple statement, a practical observation. But it was filled with a meaning that went far deeper than agriculture. He was talking about the foundation of their lives, about the potential for growth, about the possibility of a future. May turned her head to look at him, her dark eyes soft in the fading light. A small smile touched her lips. "It will be enough," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She was not just talking about the harvest. She was talking about the life they could build here, about the peace they had found in this unlikely place, with this unlikely person. He finally turned to meet her gaze. The last vestiges of the wounded, solitary man he had been were gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. He looked at her, then at the sturdy cabin behind them, then back out at the darkening plains under the immense, star-dusted sky. "It is enough," he said, and this time there was no doubt in his voice. He was not talking about the soil or the harvest or the land. He was talking about her. She was enough. She had come with nothing and had given him everything.